Um, on behalf of the Institute community, I'd like to welcome Professor Rohit Prasad. Um, Professor Rohit Prasad is a professor of economics at MDI Gurgaon. He has a PhD in economic theory from State University of New York at Stony Brook in the USA, where he studied game theory under the Nobel laureate Professor Robert Aumann. His thesis was written under the supervision of Professor Pradeep Dubey, leading professor at Stony Brook. Provides a framework to address questions related to the optimal fiscal and monetary policy choices of government in a free market. After his PhD, he worked in the software industry in the US and India in senior management positions before he joined MDI Gurgaon. His last position was vice president at Zansa, then a $700 million US firm. His research interests include the economics of ICT and sustainable development. His papers have been published at leading international journals including Telecommunications Policy and Netnomics. He's delivered seminars and talks at Harvard University, Center for Game Theory at Stony Brook, India Telecom 2009, Futurecom 2010. His articles appear regularly in the Economic Times and the EPW. His book, The Dynamics of Spectrum Management, co-authored with Dr. V. Sridhar, was published by Oxford University Press in 2014. He is the author of a popular book on entrepreneurship, Startup Sutra, published by Hachette, and Blood Red River, also published by Hachette. He's recently served on the high-powered committee of the Department of Telecommunications, Government of India, to make recommendations on spectrum allocation and pricing in India, and on 2 expert panels for the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India to study the value of 2G spectrum. He's also provided expert testimony for a major telecom operator on spectrum-related judicial proceedings. With that, I hand over to Professor Rohit Prasad and give a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Navdeep, for inviting me. It is indeed an honor to give a seminar at IIM Ahmedabad. And what I'd like to start off by saying is I'd like to share my journey with you. I just need to, sorry. Yeah. So the talk that I'm giving today is called Development Conflicts We Know Nothing Of. And perhaps I'd like to pique your interest a little bit right at the beginning by saying that this talk and the book are only fleetingly about the Maoists. Although this book is located in Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, it is only fleetingly about the Maoists. More than the Maoists, this studies the dynamics of mining companies, how they work, the constraints under which they operate, and the outcomes, and how these constraints affect the outcomes. A little bit about my journey. I'll come to the traffic jam of development later, but a little bit about my journey. You know, I came to this topic quite by accident, and for reasons that might be surprising. I had written Startup Sutra, and I'm a bit ashamed to tell you that my aim in writing Startup Sutra was to write a bestseller of the kind that students at MDI have successfully written, like Durjoy Datta and Sachin Garg, etc. And so I was taking their advice on a regular basis, and they told me that the way to become a best-selling author is to churn out books at rapid frequency with a 3-4 month interval. So even before Startup Sutra was published, I started looking for the topic for my next book. And Startup Sutra basically was based on this amazing story of this company called Echo, which is really like a story made for a Hollywood or a Bollywood potboiler, with a Sutradhar, who is a Korean mystic, who is basically, to whom chapters are devoted, in between chapters devoted to the company, in which he interprets what's going on. And so I said, this is a formula which might work. So then I thought that I'll use somebody I met called Osama Manzar as the Sutradhar of my next book, and I'll also locate that book closer to my research interests, which are in ICT. So I'll talk about ICT for Development, and Osama Manzar is a person who runs Digital Empowerment Foundation, which supports ICT projects all over India. And so he will be my Sutradhar, and the stories will be about the champions of development in the remote areas, and that will be my next book, right? And there I go, a best-selling author. Frankly, that line did not really work, because although Osama was very forthcoming and he and his wife were, very open about themselves, their lives, I wasn't really seeing a book coming out of it. But what happened was that Osama connected me to one of the projects he supports called CGNet Swar in Bhopal, and CGNet Swar runs a mobile phone news network. Right? Basically, people in remote areas can call into a number and leave news, or they can sing a song, or they can share a herbal remedy, and and people can call in to listen to all these things. So this is news being generated as well as consumed through the mobile phone, and then all this gets uploaded to the internet, so you can also consume it on the internet. So I went and met Shubhranshu, who runs this, and it was very surprising to me, naive as I was, that he spent a lot of his time telling me how he felt that communication could be the solution to the Maoist problem. It had not even occurred to me that in the area in which CGNet Swar was operating, that was the area where the Maoists were also very strong. And so he was basically operating in the teeth of the insurgency, and so naturally he was very concerned about it, and keen to bring about some solutions, etc. So, however, even though I was naive enough not to know anything about it, I recognized a good story when I heard one. And I sensed that this could be a great lead to follow. So then I joined a Gondi language workshop, which was being conducted in New Delhi by Shubhranshu and some other people and institutions. And in this workshop, I met people living inside Maoist-controlled territory, people who have to walk 2 to 3 days in order to reach their village. And the kinds of stories I heard in this language about their lives and about how democracy functions in their areas, they were absolutely hair-raising stories. And I said, I have to follow this lead. That actually, then my search for a topic and a theme ended at that workshop. And then I asked one of the people there, who's a journalist, if he could take me inside Abujmad, which is this area which is, out of bounds for the Indian administration for all practical purposes. And he said, yes, he would do that. And since, Shubhranshu vouched for him, I said, fine, I can trust him, I'll go ahead. And so I decided to go into Abujmad. I did not fulfill my aim of trying to spend a night or two in a Maoist village, because there was a swollen nala which actually blocked our progress. So although I went about 18-20 kilometers inside, I couldn't go beyond. But then there was a yatra which CGNet Swar was carrying out in January of 2015 through these areas, where they were going to tell them about this news network and getting people to participate. And so I joined that yatra, and in that yatra I spent time inside a village which had been controlled by Maoists till about 4 or 5 years ago, called Marka Beda. And just like I was telling Navdeep, he spent some time in these areas. These places are like the Garden of Eden. You cannot imagine how charming and how beautiful it is to be in these areas. So I spent some time there, and but again, in the midst of this beauty, in the midst of this pristine beauty, there were heartbreaking stories, really heartbreaking stories, and not stories about disease or deprivation, as much as the tragedy of people being caught between two implacable enemies, and what that does to people who really don't understand what they are getting into, and stories about how these two enemies are actually cooperating. These two enemies are actually hand in glove with each other in many respects, the Maoists and the government. So, so those were stories. So again, the emotions that I had, the emotions of outrage, of rage, of they told me that this is a story worth telling. But then I didn't want to finish this merely by looking at just, situation from the ground, because I said, after all, this whole story is linked to the fact that there are companies which want to do mining, or where there's a forest department which wants to do forestry, ostensibly to protect the forest. So I must get their point of view as well. And so, since my dad was at Tata Steel, and since Tata's Chhattisgarh project was a huge project, which had been planned by the Chhattisgarh government in 2005, I decided to do a deep dive into this project. And so I started looking for sources who would give me information on what was going on, why it went wrong, what was the future, and so on. So that's basically how this book happened. So this book attempts to do a 360-degree view from the ground to the boardroom, really. And present all the voices in what I call the traffic jam of development, because it is indeed a traffic jam. People think of development as a conflict which is taking place between the elite and the underprivileged and so on, but indeed it is actually a traffic jam. So this is what this jam is tame in comparison to what actually is going on, with people involved, including mining companies, forestry departments, wildlife conservationists, local populations, NGOs, urban nature lovers, so urban tourists who love to go to wildlife parks and so on, state government officials, within the state government, the political class and the law enforcing class, the central government and their dynamic with the state government, global NGOs, and not to miss out two important characters in this plot, which is global finance and competition, corporate competition. Okay, so we'll see how some of these play out in the course of my journey. So this is pretty much. So let me just tell you a little bit about the Tata Chhattisgarh project. When the state of Chhattisgarh was formed in the year 2000, it was supposed to be something which would be great for the tribal population in that state, but it was also followed by a slew of MOUs being signed with mining companies, and one of those MOUs was with Tata Steel, where they were supposed to set up a 5.5 million ton with an investment of 12,000 crores in a course of 4 years, and they got mining rights in Bailadila, and they were supposed to scout around for land and build a steel plant close to Bailadila. That was the remit that they had. The first person I met in Tata Steel was the first chief resident executive. So I'll take that slide off. The first chief resident executive of Tata Steel in Chhattisgarh, a person called Rajiv Narayan Singh. And the reason I knew I needed to meet him was because he had resigned 3 years into the Chhattisgarh project. So obviously, my instincts were tickled. I realized that if a person who is the chief resident executive of a project resigns from the company 3 years into the project, something has not gone right for that person, right? And so I wanted to meet him. And so Rajiv, who is a wonderful person, he is the son of the former chief minister of UP, T.N. Singh. In Tata Steel, Rusi Modi had a very simple formula for hiring talent. He would basically go by your lineage, and so if you were of a certain lineage, he would hire you. So he was the son of a former chief minister, and a very happy-go-lucky person. But he wanted to do great things in Chhattisgarh. He had a middling career in Tata Steel up to that point, but he said, this is my opportunity to build a new Jamshedpur in Chhattisgarh. Okay, and so he went with great dreams, and he said that there was also a lot of positive feeling about Tata Steel in Chhattisgarh, being Tata Steel, being a part of the house of Tatas. And so he said that, I was sure that this project would come through. But, for one reason or another, things kept getting postponed. some of them are standard things that go wrong. For example, you find a piece of land on which to build a steel plant, and then suddenly the state government says that no, this is also good for diamond mining, so you can't use this land, stuff like that. But then something more serious happened. He started hearing his bosses say that they were going to get a contractor into this project, right? And he was very upset that this was going to happen, because he thought he was going to do it, right? He would do whatever it took to get this project to work. He used to drive through Maoist areas all night long in order to get, prospecting maps from, remote government offices. So he was all set to do it by himself, for the company and for the country. And then suddenly he finds that there's this contractor who's going to come in and who's going to swing things for this project by operating levers in Delhi. So he was quite upset about this, and he called his MD one time, and his to find out what was happening. And his MD said, "Why are you calling me in the middle of my golf game?" And so this person was heartbroken, basically, a very emotional person. He was heartbroken that his dreams obviously didn't have the backing of the company, and so he resigned from the project. Now, then I went to I then met Jamshed Irani, who was former MD of Tata Steel, not in 2005. In 2005, he was a director on the board. Jamshed Irani was saying, I don't know much about Tata Chhattisgarh, but the company has been going through tough times, and basically we made a mistake with the Chorus acquisition, and so things have not been smooth for the company. But we, as far as hanky-panky is concerned, we are very, very above board. We ensure that we do things the right way, not just by the letter of the law, but according to ethical principles, and so on. He gave me that story, but in the middle of his interview, he let slip one thing, that there was a contractor who was involved in Tata Steel Chhattisgarh. From Rajiv Narayan had heard about the contractor. He didn't know if the contractor actually got employed. But Jamshed Irani told me that there was a contractor employed. So when I went to Jamshedpur to talk to Tata Steel executives, I kept asking them, was there a contractor? And everyone said, no, there was no contractor involved in this project. We did things our own way, but we are not making progress because the Maoists are sabotaging our project, they are blowing up equipment, and so on. But finally, I actually, through a stroke of luck, managed to track down the contractor. And even though it was late in my project, the book, the manuscript was due, and the publisher was keen that it come through quickly, I decided to follow that lead. And that lead gave me a story which I felt ultimately was the authentic story. So this contractor, who is the son of, I may have mentioned, the son of a prominent politician, I met him in Gurgaon. We were sitting next to a pool in a city club, right? He's a very well-dressed, turned-out man, fine manners and so on. But if Rajiv Narayan Singh was disappointed, the contractor was equally angry. And the story he told me was that, look, I knew that I had to get the approval of the local people, which meant therefore that I had to get the approval of those behind them, which meant the Maoists. So I didn't have any direct dealing with the Maoists, that's what he told me. But what I did was I organized seminars in the top intellectual hubs of Delhi. And this is another theme which I want to actually emphasize, that a lot of what happens in Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, both from the side of the Maoists as well as from the side of the government, is actually determined in Delhi. Okay? So he organized these seminars in Delhi, and he said that the top left-wing intellectuals attended them, they presented papers. I got a message from Kobad Gandhi from Tihar jail saying that these are the conditions under which projects are acceptable to us. And then of course I spoke to people on the ground, and I spoke to everyone in between, and I was sure that there would be no problem from the core Maoist group after all this, right? And so I built a 27-kilometer road in the prospecting area. I built 9 bridges with no problem, and then my equipment got blown up 3 times, right? 1 time, 2nd time, a 3rd time. So I was shocked, he said, and when I made inquiries, this is the words he used. He said, my hypothesis is that the sabotage was carried out by rival contractors with the help of politicians, with the help of certain elements in the government, and with fringe elements of the Maoists. His hypothesis is that the core group of Maoists was not involved, because if they had been involved, they could have actually sabotaged his project any time when he was building that 27-kilometer road. That's his view of the project. Now, why was this happening? The rival contractors that he accused, one was a government contractor of a public sector corporation, and the other was a private sector corporation's contractor, right? The private sector corporation had not been able to make progress. They had signed an MOU at the same time as Tata Steel, but their MOU, they had not been able to make progress. Tata Steel was making progress, so they sabotaged the project. The government contractor was representing a company which had been supposed to make a steel plant in that area for the last 40 years. And it's a project which is still being revived. And so their project was not getting off the ground. But why were the politicians involved? Well, the politicians were involved because they had bought land around the projects that had earlier been planned. And now there was this new project which had come onto the scene, which was appearing to take off while other projects were not taking off. So what would happen to their investment in real estate? So that was what happened. But that was not the crux of his disappointment, of the contractor's disappointment. I said, then obviously you had to pull out. Obviously Tata Steel had to pull out. He says, no. I actually made agreements with these contractors. I contacted them. I made sure that we entered into some agreement. He didn't tell me what the terms of the agreement were. And I was ready to put my men one more time. But the company didn't support me. The company could have supported me. They chose to use the Maoist threat as a pretext to pull out of the project. And the reason was that there was no money in the company after the 2008 financial crisis. Just to understand this point a little further, let us remember the enormity of the mineral wealth that lies in those areas. This Baila Dila is either the richest source of iron ore in the world or the 2nd richest source. I think it's the richest. Maybe Raughat is the 2nd richest. I mean, unimaginable mineral wealth. Unimaginable mineral wealth. So if a contractor loses 100 men in the course of a project due to sabotage, and he didn't lose a single person, only his equipment was sabotaged. If he loses 100 men, if he loses 200 men, it's no sweat off his back. Let's think in real terms. It's no sweat off his back. The contractor and the company stands in a position to make billions, at least millions, if not billions. Okay? So I buy the contractor's story that the company pulled out only because the business cycle had turned south and they didn't have the appetite to make an investment. So, and now in 2014, the contract was terminated. So, if I look at the traffic jam of development, people think about the development conflict as happening, as I said, between the elites and the underprivileged, but there's a whole amount of complexity in there. Of course, somewhere in there is the poor CSR manager who's trying to do a good job, and I met the Tata Steel CSR manager, who's a wonderfully, well-intentioned person, right? Who, if I take him at his words at his face value, does not seem to know what was happening on the ground. That there was a contractor employed, that there was that roads had been built, that sabotage had taken place, and so on. And of course, there is a conflict between the CSR manager and the line manager. That's something that we expect. The good guys oppose the people who are attempting to make a profit. But then there is this contractor who is in the picture, and there's a conflict between the line manager and the contractor. The line manager who's trying to work within the parameters of the regulatory framework in which the company operates, and the contractor who is at one remove from that regulatory framework and has more freedom, right? And repeatedly in the course of my field work, I came across instances where all the dirty work of the companies is carried out by their contractors, right? This gives an entirely new meaning to the benefits of outsourcing. Repeatedly I came across this theme. Okay, so we need to include this person in that narrative of the development conflict. Even within the project affected people, it's not a homogeneous mass of helpless people. There's always people within this group who are pro-industry, right? Remember that even in the, I'll take an example which might seem unfair to corporates, but even in concentration camps run by Nazis, the dirty work was carried out by a class of people called capos, who were Jewish prisoners who were given special privileges, right, in terms of cheese and cigarettes and freedom and all that, to do some of the dirty work, much of the dirty work. And there is this class of people within the project affected people. This class of people consists of two kinds within this class. One is people who somehow rise beyond their role as pawns of industry to become entities in their own right, entities which may actually pose a threat to their handlers. An example of such a person was Mahendra Karma. I don't know how many of you have heard of this person. If you have not heard of Mahendra Karma, please do some reading about him. This is a person about whom a Bollywood film can easily be made. He was an Adivasi tribal chief who was initially sympathetic to the Maoists, but his relations with them started souring when they started attacking tribal chiefs. And he basically is the architect of the Government of India's policy in Chhattisgarh since 1990, virtually. Whoever is in power, he got killed in the 2013 attack. Whoever was in power, one thing was in no doubt, that Mahendra Karma called the shots. Okay? And he is the architect of this fake vigilante movement called Salva Judum and so on, right? So, and he became such a powerful personality in Chhattisgarh, right, that there are conspiracy theories which say that even though he was ostensibly killed by the Maoists, and he was, there may have been involvement or at least awareness, knowledge among some members of some of the political parties. Okay? The other class within this pro-industry group are the pure pawns. Okay, these are pure pawns who have been bought off with some contracts, or sometimes for peanuts. They are bought off for peanuts in order to do the bidding of the elites. And I'll tell you a very interesting story, my personal experience of such a person in a minute. Then of course there are people who are anti-industry and who take a vocal position against this. But one point which I want to also emphasize here is this particular layer. I've already mentioned this layer of competitors who are a threat to development projects. I want to mention this particular layer of global finance, and those who are the captains of global finance. In this I should include the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, who basically regulate or don't regulate the movement of global capital, creating these booms and busts. Okay? If you think about the Tata Steel Chhattisgarh project, if you talk to the activists, they'll say that the project got cancelled because of the sterling work done by activists who literally sacrificed their lives for this project. And yes, there are such activists who have shown extraordinary courage, extraordinary commitment, sacrifice to stick it out in this area. But my hypothesis, and this is a provocative hypothesis, is that if the global commodities cycle had been in a boom phase, the Tata Steel Chhattisgarh project would have got off the ground, irrespective of what the activists were doing. Okay? So now, but the reverse is also true. The reason that Ratan Tata is a villain today in Tata Steel, the reason that Nusli Wadia is raising a hue and cry about the Tata Chorus deal today and the role of independent directors in Tata Steel is precisely because of that same global commodity cycle. If it had worked, he would have been a visionary. Since the commodity cycle went bust, he is now a villain, but pretty much he is neither a visionary nor a villain. He is also a pawn to some extent. Although if I was to take an angle, if I was to look at it from the prism of leadership, if I was to look at it from the prism of ethics, then I cannot just make the systemic forces the only explanatory variable in this situation, right? But yes, we need to really pay attention to this, the workings of the global commodity cycle. And now I'll tell you the second story about the second kind of pro-industry person, the pawn, right? But before I do that, I've already mentioned that there are conflicts between, Federal Reserve and the RBI, right? Something that Raghuram Rajan used to constantly emphasize, that there needs to be some coordination in global finance between company and company, between promoters versus independent directors, right? This is the fight between Ratan Tata and Nusli Wadia over whether Tata Steel should have gone into chorus or whether it should have focused on its India projects. Line manager versus contractor, central versus state government, because you see the state government was BJP and central government at that time was Congress, and this person Rajiv Narayan Singh was constantly told, let's see how you can succeed. The state government might give you permission, but we've got the central government and they will make sure that this project doesn't take off the ground, because then it will go to the credit of the BJP, right? And it would happen if the parties were reversed also. CSR versus rest of company, right? So that's always a struggle. But these are some remains of the Tata Steel project. Yeah. Now let me tell you another story of a project of Jindal Steel and Power in northern Chhattisgarh, where Maoists are not present. And in that area, I got entangled in a legal case. And what happened was that, I keep making fun of my desire to write a bestseller. What can I do? So I wanted to get more racy stories about mining. So when I went back to Delhi, I contacted a person called Sridhar, who runs this NGO called Environics, and this network of NGOs called Mines, Minerals and People. And I said, tell me some stories about mining, about how mean the mining companies are and how helpless the people are and so on. Tell me some stories. So he said, well, I can tell you stories, but there's a person here in my office who you should meet, Haripriya Patel. So yeah, I said, sure, I'd love to meet her. So I went and met. Actually, I went and met Sridhar, and in the course of the conversation, he told me that there's, you want stories about mining, and there's Haripriya Patel, who's in my office, who's in my guest house. Why don't you meet her? So I met Haripriya Patel, and she told me that her land had been forcibly acquired by Jindal Steel and Power Corporation, and that she had fought a case against them, had won a victory in the lower courts, and the case was now in appeal in the high court, and so on. And she told me that she had been raped twice by officials of the company. And when she narrated that, she shed tears, and I was quite flabbergasted. I didn't know how to react. Yeah, I didn't expect this, and so on. But my tape recorder kept rolling, and I got that interview. The next morning, I get a call from Sridhar saying that, Rohit, Haripriya Patel has accused you of attempting to inject her, and having failed to do that, to forcibly make her consume some poisonous substance, and then take her signatures on false documents absolving Jindal, because you are a Jindal man, and she is admitted to hospital, and Sub-Inspector Mahipal Singh would like to speak to you. So please come to the police station. Now, I had nothing to do with Jindal, nothing to do with Jindal at all. If anything, my heart, my sympathies were with Haripriya Patel and those like her. Okay, I tried desperately to quash the case, that this complaint should not get converted into an FIR, because I thought I'd lose my job if this became an FIR. But even as I was, pulling all the strings I could, and thank God this case happened in Delhi, not in Chhattisgarh, one of the people I had contacted, one of my contacts, told me on about 5 days after the complaint, what are you talking about? The FIR is registered. The FIR was registered 2 days after the complaint. So the question is, who was this? How was this Adivasi woman operating so smoothly? Able to register an FIR with absolutely no evidence, with the investigation having come up with absolutely no clues, right? How was she able to do this? And then I found that her lawyer, I had heard that her lawyer was somebody called Sharma. I later discovered that this Sharma was M.L. Sharma, who is a notorious lawyer of Delhi. And he is the defendant in the Nirbhaya case. And he is, as sleazy as they come. Okay? And he was defending her, so I had no chance actually. With such an influential person in, representing her, the FIR had to be registered. Luckily, I had the recording of the interview. I had photographs. It was in an office which was glass doors, so people could look inside. Sridhar's NGO vouched for me. They stood up for me, right? So the FIR didn't go anywhere. It's basically a dead case, although the FIR has not yet been closed. Okay. The question is, why did M.L. Sharma, who is such a powerful man, have to represent Haripriya Patel? Right? And the reason is that behind M.L. Sharma is another company who is a rival of Jindal. And the strategy of that company is that wherever Jindal has projects, to basically send people to dig dirt. And if they, of course, dirt on land acquisition is standard stuff, all companies are guilty. And Jindal more than any other company. But this corporate rival does not want simple stuff. They want rape cases, they want assault, they want all kinds of sleazy stuff. Right? So this guy goes and tutors them. And the reason I know that is that I contacted the NGO who had helped Haripriya Patel win her legal battles on the land acquisition. And this is a very well-respected NGO and a very well-respected person who's won an international award for stopping some of these projects. And I asked him, did anyone ever engage in such activity, physical assault, etc.? They said, to the best of my knowledge, over the last 10 years that I've been here, nothing of the sort has happened. right? Now, that convinced me that there was no truth to that these charges were all fabricated, and what also convinced me was the case against me and the tears that this lady had shed. My God, unbelievable acting ability. Then I asked this NGO, I asked them, if there was no rape case, then why were you supporting this lady? She said, I don't have any knowledge of this, but I don't believe that. The reason is that this lady was escorted to Delhi by a very senior member of this NGO, right? So what I'm saying is, look, now what has happened to this lady today? She is what I call a pure pawn. She is a pure pawn. Today she has been abandoned by ML Sharma and by the company that was propping her up. And I think they were propping her up for peanuts. I'm sure of that. It was all promises. I don't think she may not have made anything from it. Right? The entire landscape is strewn with such pawns who are promised big things to go against or to fulfill somebody's agenda, and they get nothing out of it. So I'll probably end with a small story to show how this agenda of the corporates has subverted all democratic processes in such areas. This is in this matter of subverting democracy, of subverting the rule of law, all the companies are aligned with each other. And within that, they then fight with each other. Okay? So the development conflict, as far as I'm concerned, is the conflict basically between the elites. And time and again, you come across complaints about Maoists which are often not true. Okay, there's a story in this book about Sister Valsa, and how people said that she was killed by Maoists, but the courts proved that she was not killed by Maoists. She was killed by local people who were being used as pawns by the company. But I'll tell you the story about democracy. So when I reached Kanker in order to go to Abujmar, again, small town back of beyond, shoddy little place, the whole town was rife with the rumor that in the recent by-election to Antagad, 6 of the candidates had been kidnapped. And people were upset that, these things happen in Bihar but not in Chhattisgarh, and now we've reached a new low and all that. What was more important was that they said that the SP himself had been involved in the kidnapping. So I went and met this SP called R.N. Dash. I met this SP, and I was, as I told Vanita, I have never done this kind of research before. I'm basically more of like a data or a theoretical modeling person. So I went and asked this SP, look, this town is abuzz with rumors about this kidnapping, and people tell me that you were involved in the kidnapping. Did you do it? So this SP tells me that, look, I know that there are these rumors, and it's very unfortunate, but let me tell you, I did not do the kidnapping. And if you want any proof, you can look at my phone, my call records for that night. I said, no, that's fine, I don't need to look at your call records. But one thing became very established, that a kidnapping had taken place. Right? So, and then what happened was that ultimately in this election, every candidate, there were 14 candidates on the ballot box, every candidate withdrew, except one who reached but wasn't in time to withdraw the candidature because the deadline had passed. There was just one candidate, the BJP candidate, who got elected virtually unopposed. 1 year later, that is about 5 months ago, this story broke in the national media. And this is how it broke. The Congress candidate, the Adivasi who had stood in that reserved constituency, who was a winning candidate, had been promised money to withdraw his candidature by the son of Ajit Jogi, who at that time was, I think, the head of the Pradesh Congress Committee. And Ajit Jogi had been given money by the son-in-law of Raman Singh. Now 1 year passed and this poor chap never got his money. So then he cried foul. He said, look, neither am I an MLA, nor do I have the money. The least I can do is tell the national press about it. Right? So this is how democracy works there. This is how the police force, the excesses of the police force are quite well known to anyone who takes interest in these matters. So I'll end at this point, and if there are any questions, we can have a discussion.
Yeah. Very slightly you have highlighted this thing, but you have very slightly touched the role of international finance organizations, IMF and all that, and where you have linked it to, say, are you saying that they are controlling the boom and bust of these cycles, the commodity cycles?
See,
because that established, if they are, in that case, they will have a greater influence on what happens within India.
Yeah, absolutely. I am saying that. See, there is after the 2008 financial crisis, there was a realization that the way that global finance was operating was faulty. And basically, there were two kinds of problems. One was that the regulation of global finance was pro-cyclical. In other words, when there was a boom, then deregulation would take place so that more investment could flow. When there was a bust, then everyone would become very tight. The regulation would become tight. Okay? This is exactly the wrong way to do it. In order to control the movement of global finance, you have to operate in a counter-cyclical way. That in a boom, you have to apply the brakes. In a bust, you have to release the brakes, right? That's one problem. The other problem is the lack of comprehensiveness of global finance regulation. Okay? So, for example, an entity in the US is protected by the lender of last resort provisions in the US. So, they can go ahead and make all kinds of investments in areas where there is relatively low regulation of all kinds, financial regulation, labor regulation, etc., knowing that they will be protected, right? But what about these entities when the business cycle turns south, right? So lack of comprehensiveness. So one of the suggestions made after 2008 was there should be that you cannot make proper regulation if there is no representation from developing countries which are right now at the forefront of the impact of global finance. So, for example, the Bank of International Settlements, there's a bank, I forget what it's called, the Bank Regulation and Bureau Board in Basel. They have now expanded the list of countries who are part of their decision-making bodies. A similar kind of initiative needs to be done at the IMF level, and so on. But yes, this is one of my findings, that it is global finance which is pulling the strings.
Yeah. So when you were discussing with all these, when you were interacting with all these participants, as a researcher, you were getting a lot of views which were in contradiction to each other.
Yeah.
So did you present all the views when you presented to the audience, or do you actually use your own ideological stance to interpret these views and then come up with your own story?
First of all, I present all the views. So if you read the book, I have every single view represented there. So I present all the views, and I present it in a sympathetic manner, because I truly am sympathetic to all of them. I understand the contractor, I understand the compulsions of Ratan Tata, I genuinely do. I understand the compulsions of the line manager. I will, again, how do I decide what really happened? For me, the litmus test is, does the story make sense? So it's very subjective. It's very subjective. And I don't make any attempt to hide that subjectivity. I don't make any attempt to hide who I am. In fact, I constantly emphasize it. But for me, once I heard the contractor story, I was convinced. I wasn't convinced before that. Somehow there was something missing. What really happened? I mean, it was a story. It was like my thesis, when I was writing my thesis on economic theory. My advisor was telling me like 9 months before I finally submitted, or maybe a year, you're done. But neither was he convinced, nor was I convinced. But then at a certain point, after being a very laggard student of his for a long time, I actually came up with a solution which he had not thought of. And then both he and I knew that the thesis was done. It wasn't a very great thesis, but it was done at that point and not before. So that's how, it is subjective.
How do you avoid being journalistic? That, as a journalist present can be a very different manner from researcher. How do you avoid?
See, I think there is, first of all, I'll make two comments. One is, there is nothing wrong in being a journalist. In fact, I have never written a case before, but my conclusion after this research is that you need all the instincts of an investigative journalist in order to write a good case. So in fact, I emphasize that aspect, the journalistic aspect. In terms of bringing a researcher's perspective, I always attempt to look at larger trends. So for example, in this book, I look at this as at least 200-year-old story. This is a story which started with the fall of Tipu Sultan in 1799, after which the British gained control of the Malabar forests and started the process of the exploitation of the forest. That is the story that has pretty much been continuing unchecked for the last 200 years. In one case, it was a colonial power using it for their mother country, and then it was the Indian state using it for the benefit of the Indian state, and after 1991, it was the private sector combined with the state which is using it for private enrichment. Right? So it's the same story. So I attempt, then again, this story of the global finance and how it plays. So then I position this story within that context. So basically, my technique is that I always try to position these events within the larger context, and try to point out the forces at play.
So you talked about the traffic jams.
Yeah.
So what really are the implications that one can sort of look at of these development conflicts?
Right. See, I think that the question that you're asking is really, I think, about this. Ideas. What are some resolutions or solutions? I know you didn't ask that question, but I think this naturally leads into this slide. And basically, I think that there are two kinds of ideas. One are ideas which are normative, which say, this should happen. And then there are ideas which actually reflect the ground realities and the balance of forces, and in terms of, some of these are actually normative ideas, some are reflecting ground realities, and some are both. Now, global financial regulator, I think, is the need of the hour. If you look at the frequency of these boom and bust cycles, you'll realize, that people have started waking up to the fact that you need a global financial regulator. Whether that happens now with or it happens in 10 years, I don't know, but people have started realizing that. I think we should insulate our mining activities from the global commodities cycle. Look, we talk about mining being necessary for development, right? We talk about the fact that the per capita consumption of steel in India is 1/5 that of China. The per capita consumption of energy is 1/10 that of China, or somewhere thereabouts. But let's also not forget the fact that 50% of the iron ore mined in India between 2004 and 2011 was exported. And exported in a way that the government gained virtually nothing. It led to basically private enrichment, right? So we are basically just in the same position as we were during colonial times, a producer of primary commodities, right? So certainly that's not a good situation to be in. So I think that we should insulate our mining activities from the global commodity cycle. I also believe that local people can benefit only if there are regionally self-contained models of mineral use. Not only should minerals not be exported from the country in large amounts, but they should not be exported from regional pockets beyond a point. Because it's only when the end use of the mineral happens within that area that some jobs get generated. One of the ground realities of mining today is that mining is now become very capital intensive. An example of that is that the mineral production in India increased 4-fold between 2004 and 2013, but the number of people employed in mining declined from 5.5 lakhs to about 5 lakhs. So, and this space is actually accelerating the capital intensity of mining. Even the end use, for example, steel production, is now becoming very capital intensive. This is a problem not just of India, this is a problem that capitalism faces all over the world. But the ancillary industries around steel, for example, have the potential to generate employment. So I think we should have regionally self-contained models of mineral use. Better corporate governance, because as I said, there's this conflict between the promoter and the independent director, right? Especially when the promoter is basically a scion of the family which started the business. They somehow seem to have some greater power over the board. And so I think that better corporate governance would help to make sure that decisions were less influenced by the visionary the whimsical visions of the promoter. I think that we need to introduce corporate liability for the actions of contractors. And here is another idea. People say that industrialization is needed for development. I think development should take place before industrialization. And development, by development, I mean basic education and health in the areas which are going to be affected by projects. Because it's only then that these people will not get run over or trampled by the development machine. And there is enough, if we were to use our resources more effectively, there is enough slack in the system for this to be possible. One area of leakage is, of course, corruption, which we all know about. But another area is, just that we should try to prevent what appears to be private hoarding of natural resources. And I'll give you an example of bauxite. The amount of bauxite mines already cleared can meet our annual needs of bauxite for the next 50 years. Then why do we need to clear more land for bauxite mining? Right? And yet, more land is continuously getting cleared in response to the global commodity cycle. I think that there should be more democracy. I think that in order that the local people should have more of a say in deciding whether they want a project or not. But this is really a very normative statement. I don't think that there can be, I can take this very seriously because things are always determined by power equations. What gives me some hope is the fact that I see the next 10 years at least as a bad time for globalization. I think that the global commodities boom-bust cycle is going to take a hit for the next 10 years as countries become more protectionist. And countries are going to be having to rely on home markets for growth. And I think that's a good thing. That's a force which is going to help project-affected people. Because first of all, there'll be fewer projects which will take off the ground. And secondly, if projects do take off the ground, they will only take off the ground if there's enough demand in the home market, which means that you have to spread the wealth out more evenly. Right? So these are some ideas for resolutions or solutions. Yeah. I think there's a question there.
So with respect to development before industrialization, you gave your listing of basically health and education, right sir?
Yeah.
My this thing is that development in today's age, essentially everything and everything comes after you have infrastructure, primarily roads in place. If you have better connectivity, you'll have better education, you'll have better healthcare, and everything else that follows. It will be faster, it will be cheaper, it will be efficient and effective. If you do not have roads running through these places, which is I suppose one of the biggest lacunas for whatever reasons. As a country, we've been about 4-5 decades behind so far as putting infrastructure, especially roads in place. And I suppose here also, in case, I mean, a couple of months back, I suppose the government did announce something specifically for this particular area. Hope it is just not an announcement, it materializes on ground as well. But any development without roads in place, I suppose, is again just a wish list.
Okay. See,
I'll tell you, suppose I was to say that every house needs a door. Right? You would agree with me? It needs a front door or a back door or a window. They need it. But what if this door is used primarily to loot the house? Then would the house still need a door? See, that is the reality of the situation. That these roads are used, and this is happening for the last 200 years. 200 years. This is a momentum which is really powerful. For 200 years, why did the British build railways? To make sure that materials got transported from the hinterland to the coast, that forces got transported. It was the 1857 mutiny which gave an impetus to the growth of railways in India. Okay, so roads, and okay, there's a lot of discussion of roads in this book, by the way, because I went and met an IAS officer, and Maoists hate roads, blacktop roads. They hate them because these roads allow forces to come into these areas. So I asked him that, how do you operate, because the Maoists don't allow you to build roads. So he said, there are many kinds of roads. There are second grade roads, there are blacktop roads, there are village roads. Maoists don't mind roads which are second grade roads because they don't object to PDS grain being taken to the village. They object to a blacktop road because that will bring the army in, or the CRPF in. They don't object to culvert bridges. They object to big bridges. Okay. So what I'm saying is, okay, I'll give you another point of view. Just because Maoists don't like roads doesn't mean that I have to not like roads. I'm not saying that. But you see, what is important for these areas is that there should be trade between these villages in Chhattisgarh, between Sukma and Bijapur, between Narayanpur and Bastar. So build roads which allow that trade to happen. Why do you want to build a road which will allow the mineral of Dantewada to go to Delhi? That's my submission.
So there are no other questions. Thank you, Professor Prasad. It's very rare that people from institutions such as us, in the fraternity, ever do such kind of work. So it's courageous work, no doubt. But I think it's even more courageous to report it the way you have. So thank you for.
Thank you. Thank you.